who is perceived as virtuous and leads a life of luxury like Gyges. But to get us to that conclusion, Plato takes us on a roundabout journey, a great big argument from analogy. He's going to describe what the virtuous or just society looks like and compare that to what the most just or virtuous individual is like. And he'll argue, in the same way that the virtue of the best kind of society leads to the most flourishing, so too will the virtue of the individual lead to flourishing. And so the Republic will serve as the perfect transition between our previous section on ethics and the upcoming section on political philosophy. In our final defense of the notion that a virtuous life is the best and only way to achieve eudaimonia, we'll also see one of the most famous arguments for how society ought to be organized. So, let's dive right in. Now, remember, even though Plato wrote the Republic, Plato's work, it's a dialogue that features the character of Socrates as its protagonist. So all the arguments that come out of Socrates' mouth, but in a certain kind of way, they're also Plato's arguments. In the Republic, according to Socrates, the most just society, what he called the Republic, would be divided into 3 classes, each dedicated to a specific function. The workers, the guardians, or what he later calls the auxiliary, and the rulers. Now keep in mind that Plato was conceiving of a city-state, so his suggestion is far more applicable to kind of a smaller population. But it might still be possible to expand his ideas to nation-states as large as we know today. For example, the workers would be dedicated in Plato's Republic to supplying the material needs of the Republic. The food and water, the housing, the clothes. Today, this would include farmers, healthcare workers, sanitation workers, and educators. In the Republic, the auxiliary, in Plato's society, the auxiliary is dedicated to protecting the public and keeping it in order. This would be kind of a combination military police force. Its members, or soldiers, let's call them, would be military in that they would protect the city from foreign invasion. They would also be police in that they would keep the city in order. If any of the workers got out of line by disobeying the laws of the city, by stealing, for example, it would be the soldiers of the auxiliary who would set them straight. Ideally, these soldiers would be perfectly dedicated to the state, willing to die in its service. And as such, they would own no property, Socrates says. Everything they need would be provided by the state. What's more, Socrates says, they would be engaged in a selective breeding program, where the strongest and smartest soldiers were paired together as mates to ensure an ever-improving class of soldiers in the future. The members of the auxiliary themselves would be courageous, loyal, educated, and, of course, in superior physical condition, and certainly would think it better to die in service than to live outside of it. The rulers, whose obvious role would be that of the leadership of the Republic to rule it, must be courageous and loyal as well, but most importantly, they should be wise. They should have a good understanding of how societies function, what laws are best, how they are best enforced, and so on. According to Plato, this is only possible if one has an intimate knowledge of the forms. Remember the forms? The abstract objects that are the perfect examples of justice and fairness, etc. So the rulers would be philosophers. This is where we get the term the philosopher king. Now, you might think that this is just self-serving. Of course, Socrates wants philosophers to be the rulers. He's a philosopher. But Socrates points out that neither he nor any philosopher would actually want to rule. A true philosopher seeks wisdom above all else, and the drudgery and responsibility of ruling would simply be a distraction from that quest. I know I feel this way about eventually becoming chair of my department. All of those administrative duties are going to get in the way of my research and teaching. Likewise, the philosopher would rather be doing philosophy than ruling. But the philosophers will fulfill their duty to rule anyway, not only out of a sense of duty, but also because they would dread being ruled over by someone who is not a proper ruler, someone who doesn't understand justice and virtue and the forms. Right? To ensure that every person plays the role best suited to their abilities, that everyone finds themselves in the class in which they belong, the state will evaluate all persons and place them accordingly. In fact, all children will be raised by the state in the Republic. Their talents and abilities will be decided at an early age, and they'll be trained for and then placed into the appropriate class when they're adults. In fact, Socrates suggests that the only way to really accomplish such a state, to really accomplish the Republic, would be to start from scratch, with a population of children that you subsequently trained and then placed in their proper places. Sanctioning off adults into classes, it simply just would not be feasible. Now, Socrates admits that such a city would be unstable, it would be sick, if you will, because of what he called pleonexia, the human tendency to overreach. Those placed in a certain class may think they deserve more. Certain workers might want to be a soldier or be a ruler, positions for which they are unqualified. To avoid this problem, Socrates suggests telling the populace a noble lie. What is that lie? That the gods had determined everyone's class by placing metal into everyone. The workers have iron and bronze, and soldiers have silver in them, and the rulers have gold. Of course, Socrates knows this is bunk. I personally doubt whether Plato or Socrates actually believed in the gods anyway. But this lie, adequately reinforced, would stabilize the Republic and keep everyone in their place. Socrates argues that this society is just, and indeed virtuous, because of its organization and the properties it has. The Republic embodies the intellectual virtues because the rulers are wise. The Republic is courageous because the soldiers of the auxiliary are courageous. And the Republic is temperate because it is self-controlled. Everyone does their own job, and the auxiliary keeps the workers in line. But all of this is also Socrates' way of explaining what a just and virtuous person is like. A virtuous person is like the Republic. They're organized in the same kind of way. According to Socrates, a person's mind or soul, and we need not think of souls in this case as a separable entity, although Plato did think of them this way. But for Socrates, a person's mind or soul is divided into three parts. We have what he called a tripartite soul, which consists of the logos, our reason, the thymos, our spirit or our drive, and the epithemia, our appetites. And a virtuous person has those parts organized like the Republic organizes its classes. So for the virtuous person, reason rules. It sets the laws and makes the decisions just like the rulers in the Republic. This is what makes a virtuous person wise. The appetites, like the workers, provide for the needs of the body. For example, the appetite of hunger causes one to fulfill his nutritional needs. And our drive keeps those appetites in line. It does not allow them to rule or be in control. It exercises willpower over them. So in this way, the virtuous person is temperate or controlled. Our drive is also responsible for defending the body in a responsible way from those who might harm it. This is what makes the virtuous person courageous. So, a just state is one in which each class is fulfilling its function. The workers provide the necessities, the soldiers control and protect the workers, and the rulers rule with wisdom. Likewise, a just person is one whose parts are fulfilling their proper function, whose appetites provide the necessities of survival, but don't control the person because they are tempered by their drive, and whose drive protects the person, but is ultimately ruled by reason. Plato argues that such a virtuous person flourishes, attains eudaimonia, in the same way and for the same reason that the Republic flourishes. This is why the virtuous person is better off than the wicked person, even if the virtuous person is scorned and the wicked person is not. And to make his case that this is true, Socrates draws an analogy between different kinds of governments or societies and different kinds of persons, and shows that a kind of more virtue, more flourishing pattern emerges in both. We can best understand the analogy with a mental chart that has the virtuous state, the republic, on the left, and the virtuous person on the right. We'll imagine those on top, the virtuous versions on top, and we'll work our way down. If the republic were to degenerate into the second best form of government, it would turn into a timocracy, says Socrates, a city ruled by its soldiers. The auxiliary would overthrow the rulers and take charge. The main goal of such a city would be the preservation of its honor, so to speak, its own protection. It might not even be unlike a police state. Analogously, we might think of a person who holds self-protection and honor as their highest value, a person whose drive or their competitive nature completely rules them. That would be somewhat analogous to this kind of timocracy. We might think of a gentleman duelist as an example of such a person, someone who is constantly slapping people in the face with his glove when they insult his honor. Or better yet, think of the race of Klingons from Star Trek, whose main goal in life is to preserve their honor and die in battle. But, Socrates argues, this new ruling class is apt to become corrupt. Once it's secure from invasion, wealth will become the ruler's new priority. And so the society will degenerate or degrade into an oligarchy, a city where a small rich minority govern over a larger but much more poorer class. Compare this to a person whose main goal is the acquisition of wealth. Unlike with Epicureanism, here I think we can think of the Wolf of Wall Street, Jordan Belfort, whose appetite for wealth ruled him. It, not his reason, kept his other appetites in line, but only to make sure that he can acquire more wealth. But as the poor become fed up and realize that they will revolt, says Socrates, and turn the oligarchy into a democracy, a government where the workers rule. Now, it's important to note that Socrates did not have in mind the kind of representative democracy we have today, where we elect representatives to a governing body. And I'm not so sure how he would have regarded it. My guess is probably not too highly. Notice that democracy is pretty far down on the list here. We're getting worse and worse forms of government. Instead, he's talking about a direct democracy, where every person has exactly one vote in every decision the government makes, where there is no president or Congress, and every person has exactly the same power in every decision, and the majority always rules. One shortcoming of a direct democracy, says Socrates, is that in practice, it simply leads to the power resting in whoever can manipulate popular opinion. Not only will this prevent any rational decisions from being made, but because different people can be persuasive on different days, nothing useful will ever get done. Compare this kind of government, this kind of society, to someone who is ruled by his appetites, right? Worker-ruled city, appetite-ruled person. A person who seeks to satisfy whatever appetite is currently the strongest, and then once it is fulfilled, turns to the next appetite. Here, we might think of the college frat boy spring breaker, who will let his appetite for alcohol rule him until his appetite for sex takes over, and then his appetite for food, and so on. But the real danger of democracy is freedom, says Socrates. Too much of the wrong kind of freedom. In a democracy, Socrates argues, the people will keep demanding more and more freedom from laws until they are left with anarchy. And from this anarchy, a tyrant will eventually emerge. And thus, democracy will degenerate into tyranny. And this tyrant will have to fight for control, kind of like in Game of Thrones, as other would-be rulers vie for power. And so, Plato argues, this quest in democracy for more and more freedom will likely just lead to slavery. For Socrates, real freedom on a personal level is not found in doing whatever you want to do whenever you want to do it. It's found in establishing a law within oneself and not saying yes to every appetite that springs to mind. Otherwise, certain appetites will start to vie for total control, and eventually you will be ruled by a single one. Like drug addicts are ruled by their appetite for their drug. Again, the quest for total freedom leads to slavery. As we look at these governments and societies, we see a more justice, more flourishing pattern emerge. Clearly, as you go down the list, moving from the republic to the tyranny, each society is a little bit less just than the last, and each society flourishes a little bit less than the last. There are certainly fewer opportunities for intellectual pursuits and advancements, or even for citizens to lead good lives, the further you go down the list. Conversely, as we go up the list, we see that the more just a society is, the more flourishing and the more opportunity it gives a citizen to flourish. We can see a similar pattern emerge in individuals. Clearly, the appetite-ruled drug addict does not lead a flourishing life. He is a slave to his addiction. And although it's better to be the frat boy on spring break, such an existence is still shallow and vain and not conducive to human flourishing. Allowing one's desire for wealth to temper one's own appetites is a little bit better, as is being concerned with one's honor, but clearly if the pattern holds, the kind of life most conducive to flourishing, to eudaimonia, is that of the virtuous person. The person who is wise because her reason rules her actions, courageous because her drive is properly motivated, and tempered because she controls her appetites, is the person who is most likely to live the kind of life most worth living. And so, Plato argues, it's reasonable to conclude that such a virtuous person still flourishes and is even happier than may otherwise be expected, even if they do suffer hardships, even if they're regarded by the public as unvirtuous. Being virtuous comes with its own kind of internal reward that makes it worth attaining regardless of whether it is recognized. For Plato, both the just person and the just society partake in the same thing, the form of justice. And because they do so, a similar consequence follows for both. And so now we understand the Platonic defense of the virtue ethicist claim that the reward of being virtuous is eudaimonia. We now have Plato's answer to the question, why be moral? It's the only way to lead the best kind of life. And we've just seen that, just like for Aristotle, for Plato, reason plays a prominent role in the attainment of eudaimonia. But we've also seen what Plato thought about how society ought to be organized. And in all honesty, most of us would likely not be too keen on living in Plato's Republic. We wouldn't like being lied to, told what class to live in or what job to have, or having our children raised by the state. Plato's Republic lacks the kind of freedom that you likely think is necessary for the existence of a just government. And so Plato's Republic leads to yet another set of questions. If society should not be organized, as Plato suggested, then how exactly should it be organized? Is freedom that important? If so, why? And how far should our freedoms go? How big should government be? And what are its responsibilities? Should it ensure fairness? And what justifies government in the first place? It is to those questions that we shall turn in the next and final section of this course. But before we do, let me wrap up this section with some concluding remarks. Philosophy can be frustrating because it's so difficult to find concrete answers. For example, we just studied a number of ethical theories, but each one failed in one way or the other. We didn't definitively define what's morally right and wrong, and we certainly didn't find the truth makers for moral statements we were looking for. Now, this might tempt us to draw the conclusion that, just like with free will and persons in the mind, that morality is just an illusion. The reason that we can't find a ground for moral facts is because there are none. And that might be true. However, I believe we can still take what we've learned and use it to guide our actions. How? We can use a method of moral reasoning suggested by Theodore Schick in the introduction to his textbook, Doing Philosophy, that he calls inference to the best action. Recall that when doing abduction, inference to the best explanation, we consider multiple criteria, testability, scope, etc., and choose the hypothesis that coheres with the most of them. Schick suggests we do something similar when reasoning about ethics, by taking each of the major ethical theories and treating each one of them as a criterion. The more an action aligns with them, the better it is. And when doing an action clearly fulfills more of the criteria than not doing the action, then that is the moral thing to do. If we took the 5 theories we've considered that seem to have the most traction, our criteria might look like this. Hedonistic happiness, the extent to which an action makes one's life better. Does it produce worthwhile pleasures? Kantian justice, the extent to which an action respects individual rights and treats people equally. Is it something that I could will to be universalized? Does it treat others as a means to an end? Utilitarian beneficence, the extent to which an action alleviates the most unnecessary suffering and pain and promotes the best kind of happiness. Does the action promote the good of the many over the good of the few or the one? Virtuousness, the extent to which an action reflects what a moral exemplar would do or value. Is the action consistent with a life that is conducive to well-being or eudaimonia? And feminist carefulness, the extent to which the action reflects care for others. Does the action allow me to display a justified preference for those I care about? When we are presented with ethical conundrums, we can discover what we should do by considering our options and simply figuring out which one fulfills the most of these criteria. Of course, sometimes there will be ties, so inference to the best action won't always answer all our questions, but the same is true for scientific abduction, and yet it's still the best method we have. The same would seem to be true for this kind of ethical abduction. At the very least, we could arrive at rational ethical answers more often than we did before. As you may have noticed, however, the Kantian justice criterion mentioned rights, and we haven't talked much about rights yet. That's because rights are usually the kind of thing a government is tasked to protect, and yet to do so, it seems it must inevitably infringe on them. This opens a whole host of questions about government, the most fundamental of which we shall consider next. Should government exist at all? Does it have the moral authority to do what it does? Let's start with a thought experiment, adapted from one I recall hearing from a friend of mine, Greg Elliott. He gave it in grad school. Suppose you live in a house that you recently inherited from your parents, and someone comes knocking at your door. You open it. There's a large man in a suit and tie who speaks with a stereotypically thick Italian accent. He suggests that he and his organization have been providing you and your neighborhood with protection. They keep everybody in line. They keep all the shopkeepers on the up and up, making sure they pay their protection money, and in return, his organization guarantees that their business runs smoothly. For you and your neighbors, his organization offers security, making sure to keep out outsiders. But, the gentleman claims, you haven't paid your protection money, not once. So you'd better pay it now. At this moment, you might point out that this is an arrangement that you did not agree to. You certainly didn't sign any papers to this effect, but he insists that by living in a house that is in his organization's area, you tacitly agreed to pay for the services that his organization provides. You point out that you inherited the house and that this is the only place that you can afford to live, demanding that you pay him simply because you live in your house is like the captain of a boat saying that his crew is free to leave by jumping overboard if they don't like the way that he's running things. You don't really have a choice. Doesn't matter, the gentleman insists. You use the services we provide, you live in this area, and we protect it. You got to pay up. Well, that's like washing my car in the middle of the night without asking and demanding that I pay up in the morning. I didn't ask for your protection. Pay up now, or I'm going to drag you away and lock you in a small room until you do. Would you pay him? Probably, just out of self-interest. You don't want to be hauled away. But do you think you are morally obligated to pay him? Do you think you actually owe his organization money? Would you be doing something morally wrong if you didn't pay him? Do you think it would be morally acceptable for him to haul you away? Probably not, right? I mean, sure, you live in his neighborhood, but it's not like you chose for his organization to protect you. You don't have that much control over where you live anyway. Even if you didn't inherit the house, which you did, but even if you didn't, where you live is dictated by where you were born and what job you have and what job your spouse have, and many other factors. You don't have that much choice in the matter. And even if you did, you didn't ask for his organization to provide services. So it's not like you're living there somehow morally obligates you to pay him anything just because his organization has decided on their own to protect your area. I mean, isn't that basically just extortion? So, you likely agree that he isn't morally justified in asking you for money, and in fact, he's doing something morally wrong by doing so, or by harming you if you don't. Right? You agree? Great. Glad we got that settled. Oh, forgot to mention one little detail. On his suit, he has a badge that reads police. Now, all the other details are the same. He's still suggesting that since his organization provides you in your neighborhood protection, you owe him money. Taxes, he calls it. And if you don't pay him, he's going to haul you away and lock you in a small room. Does that change anything? Now, you probably think it does, right? The fact that he has a police badge, right? But how could it? When you thought he was part of the mafia, and shame on you for falling for that Italian stereotype, but when you thought he was part of the mafia, you didn't think he was morally justified. He was extorting money from you. Now that you know he's from the government, you do think he's justified. What's the difference? Both the mafia and the government are just large organizations that provide services and protection in exchange for money, all without formal consent. So what makes one justified and the other not? The philosophers I want to consider this lecture, who are philosophical anarchists, say there is no difference, and the government is not morally justified in doing what it does. Just like you would do what the mafia person tells you to do, you would do that, you would comply out of self-interest, and they would probably agree with that in some cases, we'll see. But they don't think in any case that you're morally obligated to obey. In this next and final section, we'll be considering the general question of how government or society should be organized. Last lecture, we saw Plato's suggestion in this regard, his highly regulated republic, divided into workers and soldiers and rulers, all doing their pre-selected jobs, which they were placed in by the state that raised them. You likely objected to this model for numerous reasons, including, what right do the rulers have to tell me what I ought to do with my life? Isn't what I decide to do with my life up to me? Can't I hold any job I want? Can't I marry who I want? Plato's Republic probably has too little liberty for your taste. But that question, what right do the rulers have to tell me what to do, can be asked more generally about the government. Although our government doesn't strictly dictate what job we hold or who we marry, it does make many rules about how you ought or ought not to live your life. You can't legally, for example, be a prostitute or deal drugs or run a gambling ring, at least in most places in the country. If you want a job, there's likely a lot of red tape you have to go through to get it, and a number of regulations you have to adhere to once you do. Not to mention the large percentage of your pay that the government automatically deducts from your paycheck every pay period. If anyone else did that, it'd be theft, right? We wouldn't say that they have a right to do that. What makes the government any different? It is the anarchist claim that the government is no different, that it does not have the right to tell you what to do at all. And that's the idea I want to examine in this lecture. In his textbook, The Philosophical Journey, William Lawhead suggests that there are three kinds of anarchists: theoretical anarchists, what I would call serious anarchists, Lawhead calls them naive, and violent anarchists. Let's define each in turn. Theoretical anarchists make the simple claim that the government has no legitimate moral authority. To make this argument, they often use a thought experiment like the one that we just discussed, or simply suggest that no one person or organization has the right to restrict your movement, take your property or money in the form of taxes, or tell you how to live your life. Now, theoretical anarchists refrain from commenting on whether or not we'd be better off living under a government or living without it. Even if we were better off, according to the theoretical anarchists, doesn't matter. Government still has no moral authority. Making your life better, or even a majority of people's lives better, is not enough to give the government the right to tell you what to do. Theoretical anarchists will tolerate the existence of the government as a matter of practical necessity, and likely would suggest that most others do the same. Even though the government has no moral authority over any aspect of your life, it's not worth ruining your life to demonstrate this fact. You comply because it's more practical to comply. Most philosophical anarchists fall into this camp, into theoretical anarchy, such as Robert Paul Wolff in his 1970 book, The Defense of Anarchism. The basic idea is that individual autonomy or freedom and the rights of the government to dictate your actions are mutually exclusive. It's not possible to truly be free while living under a government. The right to freedom is inalienable. Thus, the government has no moral authority. What we might call serious anarchists take it a step further. They agree that the government has no moral authority, but take the further claim that despite the benefits that it supposedly provides, police and military protection, roads and bridges, etc., we would all be better off without government. As we shall see, serious anarchists will suggest that we would achieve the same benefits through mutual cooperation without having to sacrifice our liberty if government did not exist. Now, this is a difficult thesis to defend, however, so few philosophers fall under this camp, but there are some. For example, Aon Scoble, author of the 2008 book, Deleting the State, argues that we would all be better off if government didn't exist. Serious anarchism is related to political libertarianism. Libertarians may not be full-blown anarchists. They may think the government is useful for a few things and even think that we're morally obligated to obey a few of its laws. But libertarians often value liberty above all else and usually think the government isn't justified in restricting us from any action unless it interferes with the liberty of others or harms others. As such, they're in favor of a very small government with a limited amount of responsibility. Some are even opposed to the federal interstate system, suggesting instead that all roads should be privately owned. All of this might tempt us to place the political libertarian on the far right of the political spectrum. But a true libertarian holds many views commonly associated with the left. Their desire to protect liberty drives them to be pro-choice and for the legalization of all drugs, as well as gambling and prostitution. And they would not be in favor of any war unless the country was on the verge of invasion. While Pearl Harbor may have been enough to make libertarians approve of US involvement in World War II, most libertarians were likely opposed to US involvement in World War I, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and all the Iraq wars. Third kind, violent anarchy, is the suggestion that since A, the government has no moral authority, and or B, we would be better off without it, we ought to C, overthrow and eradicate the government, thus creating anarchy and to do so with violent means. The iconic example of a violent anarchist is Mikhail Bakunin, a 19th century Russian philosopher and contemporary of Karl Marx. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about Marx later, but it's important to bring him up now because both Marx and Bakunin's concerns and goals were the same. They were concerned with the plight of the working class at the hands of the elite and desired to bring about a classless society where everyone enjoyed equal wealth, rights, and opportunity. For Marx, the solution lay in a larger, more powerful government that would take over the means of production and make sure that everything was shared equally. But according to Bakunin, Marx's solution would not work because all forms of government, no matter how well-intentioned, inevitably lead to oppression. As he said in Statism and Anarchy, no dictatorship can have any other aim but that of self-perpetuation, and it can beget only slavery in the people tolerating it. Irony of Marxism, he thought, is that it wants freedom, but to attain that freedom, it must restrict it by relying on dictatorship. Freedom can be created only by freedom, Bakunin suggested, by a universal rebellion on the part of the people and free organization of the toiling masses from the bottom up. And so Bakunin advocated for the creation of a society without government, where smaller collections of people, syndicate unions of workers and banded groups of the unemployed, would control production, capital, buildings, and land, organize the economy, and protect the rights of their members. And the way to bring this about, Bakunin argued, was through violent revolution. The only way to create this anarchist utopia in which the government didn't exist was to destroy the government through terrorism, assassination, whatever was necessary, he said. As he said in Reaction in Germany in 1842, "Let us put our trust in the eternal spirit which destroys and annihilates only because it is the unsearchable and eternally creative source of all life. The passion for destruction is also a creative passion." End quote. Indeed, it is from those who embraced this idea that anarchists got the reputation of being rioting, violent, Molotov cocktail throwing troublemakers. But to my knowledge, anarchist or not, no philosopher today advocates violence like Bakunin did. Linguist Noam Chomsky describes himself as an anarcho-syndicalist, and clearly he was influenced by Bakunin, but although Chomsky can be quite radical and would likely be fine with small, active anti-government demonstrations, he has never advocated violent revolution to abolish the government, at least as far as I know. Bakunin's ideas are something people sometimes become enamored with in high school or college, dorm room philosophy, you might call it. A kind of extreme anti-authoritarianism is easy to adopt in one's youth. But no matter how immoral or illegitimate the government's power is, violence, terrorism, and assassinations to overthrow it are usually seen as unjustified. Two wrongs don't make a right, although I'm sure there are some exceptions. Nazi Germany, perhaps. At any rate, those philosophers who do think we'd be better off without government and who want to abolish it usually suggest we rely on nonviolent action to do so, perhaps ironically in the form of political action within the government itself. Alternatively, if enough people in the populace can just be convinced that they're better off without the government, perhaps by being exposed to philosophical argument, the government would lose the ability to enforce its laws. For this reason, I'd like to leave the topic of violent anarchy behind and instead look in more detail at the kind of arguments that theoretical anarchists put forward to defend their position. One argument is a kind of disjunctive argument for theoretical anarchy, the notion that government has no moral authority. It would seem that if the government has moral authority, then its laws have moral import. They are morally relevant. The fact that there is a law commanding or restricting something is relevant to whether or not you're going to be morally obligated, or whether you are morally obligated to perform or refrain from performing that action. But this argument suggests no law has moral import. No law is relevant to whether or not you're morally obligated to do something. Why? Well, when it comes to the morality of action, every action is either morally obligatory, merely morally permissible, or morally wrong. If the law commands you to do something morally wrong, as it was in the case of Nazi Germany, when the law commanded people to turn in Jews so that they could be sent to concentration camps, you are not morally obligated to obey. In fact, you're morally obligated to disobey. So, in the case of immoral action, no law could have moral import. That's one option. Imagine if the law commanded you to do something that is morally obligatory, like not murder people for no reason. Well, you're already obligated to do that. The fact that there is a law saying you shouldn't do that is irrelevant. You are not morally obligated not to murder people just because there's a law. Thus, in the case of morally obligatory action, the law has no moral import. Well, what if the law commanded you to do that which is merely morally permissible, but not obligatory, like wear your seatbelt? Well, then you're not really morally obligated to obey. My guess is that you likely agree with this. Although you might wear your seatbelt because you know it's safer, you don't think you're doing anything morally wrong by forgetting to do so or refusing to do so. So, in the case of morally permissible actions, the law again has no moral import. But these are the only three options. Actions are morally obligatory, morally permissible, or morally wrong. And in none of these cases does the law have any moral import. And the government has moral authority only if its laws have moral import. Therefore, the government has no moral authority. This argument's pretty tough to combat. It's definitely logically valid. Symbolize it, do a proof, you'll see that. If the theoretical anarchist is wrong, somehow the existence of the government has to create moral obligations that did not exist before. How could it possibly do that? Well, we'll see some suggestions in the next lecture. And since the theoretical anarchist admits that we might be better off with government, perhaps we could find some justification there. But before we pursue that line of argument next lecture, let's talk about another argument for theoretical anarchy, the autonomy argument. This one comes from the aforementioned Robert Paul Wolff. The fundamental assumption of moral philosophy is that people are responsible for their actions. So, the only way to truly be responsible for one's actions is to be a free, autonomous agent, to have free will and determine actions by reason. Thus, the highest virtue and primary obligation of a person is autonomy, to determine actions by free will and reason. And notice we could do a libertarian or compatibilism definition of free will here. Government necessarily infringes on autonomy. It forces people to act instead of letting them act autonomously. Life-threatening punishment is a consequence if they do not behave as it dictates. Obeying the law simply because it is the law is not acting autonomously. To truly act autonomously, one must choose to act unencumbered by threats or coercion. One can be told what is right, but one must choose to do it truly, to truly act morally. Thus, one cannot have a moral obligation to obey the law because it is the law. One must do what is morally right simply because it is morally right, regardless of the law. As Wolff says, if all men have a continuing obligation to achieve the highest degree of autonomy possible, then there would appear to be no state whose subjects have a moral obligation to obey its commands. Again, this is a difficult argument to combat. To do so, we'd have to find an obligation more important than achieving the highest degree of autonomy, or somehow argue that moral obligations will have been created by the fact that one lives under a government. The government has to create those obligations. Again, we'll talk more about such suggestions next lecture. Although I've already mentioned this before, it's important to note that the theoretical anarchists are practical. They merely suggest that the government is always overstepping its moral bounds when it forces anyone to do anything, that we aren't morally obligated to obey the law simply because it's the law. They admit that we may be better off with government in control. They just don't think that fact provides government with moral authority. But the theoretical anarchist still thinks you should obey the law for prudential reasons, for your own benefit, because you don't want to be thrown in jail if you don't. You're just not morally bound to do so. You can think about this in terms of obeying the laws of another country. You do it because you have to, not because you think you should. Wolff suggests that the serious anarchist, what I call the serious anarchist, who thinks that we would actually be better off without the government, is naive. And initially, the suggestion does seem naive. Without a police force to keep people in line, without regulation to control the quality of food and medicine, without the government to build roads and bridges, life would surely be worse, wouldn't it? Sure, we'd have more autonomy, and maybe that would be morally better, but we would not live a better or easier life as a result, not even one as easy as we do with government. To bolster their argument against the serious anarchists, theoretical anarchists, and everyone else who thinks we wouldn't be better off with government, we'd be better off with it, they point to the prisoner's dilemma as evidence. The prisoner's dilemma is a situation in which two people are given a choice of whether to cooperate or defect. Mutual cooperation will get the overall best result, but since individually defection is in their best interest, they will defect and actually get the worst possible result. I know that may seem a little confusing, so let's consider a particular case. So, two prisoners are suspected of a crime. If they both keep quiet, they will get only 1 year in jail. If each squeals on the other, they will get 4 years each. But if one squeals and the other doesn't, the squealer goes free and the other gets 6 years. Notice that for each person, it is better to defect no matter what the other person does. Say you're person A. If you think person B is going to squeal, then you should squeal too. If person B squeals and you don't, you'll get 6 years. But if you squeal too, you only get 4. But if you think he's going to cooperate, you should still squeal. If you both cooperate, you'll still get a year, but if you squeal and they don't, then you get nothing. So again, regardless of what the other person does, it's better for you to defect, to squeal. Of course, the same is true for person B in the scenario. No matter what person A does, it's better to defect, so both will defect. But notice, that's the worst possible overall result. If they both defected collectively, they will serve 8 years. If only one defected, there would only be 6 years served total, and if they both just cooperated, they'd only get 2 collectively. Without any overarching influence to guarantee that they cooperate, they get the worst possible overall result. Likewise, the anti-anarchist argues, without government, we would always get the worst result. Government forces cooperation so that we get the best result. Take the government regulations about the environment. For any one company, a business model that ignores their environmental impact, that lets them dump their waste into rivers, more carbon into the air, etc., is more economical. It's much cheaper than finding and executing ecologically sound ways to dispose of such waste. Regardless of what others are doing, that will always be cheaper and more profitable. But if everyone did that all the time, we'd have no potable drinking water, and we'd all be cooking because of global warming, which of course is the worst possible and ultimately least profitable result. Environmental regulations are the government's way of forcing everyone to cooperate. But serious anarchists like Scoble counter this argument by suggesting that the prisoner dilemma is flawed. This only happens when the prisoners are given one try. When multiple tries are allowed, which is much more like the real world, people learn to cooperate without government, without any overarching influence. Like in what I call the bean game. The bean game is a game with two people where it's always in one's interest to defect, but mutual defection gets the worst result, and only cooperation gets to the goal. Here are the rules of the bean game. There are two players. The object is to simply increase your count of beans by 5. If you do, I play this with my students, you get 10 bonus points on the final. If you don't, you lose 20 points on the final. On each turn, you can place down either 1 bean or 2 beans. And there will be 10 turns total. If you both place down 1 bean, each person gets no extra beans. If you both place down 2 beans, then each person gets 1 more bean. However, if one places 2 and the other one just places 1, she who places 1 gets the other person's 2 beans. Notice 2 things. Regardless of what the other person does, it is always better to put down 1 bean. If they're going to put down 1 2, you should put down 1 to protect your 2 from being stolen. But if they're going to put down 2, then you should still just put down 1. That way you'll get their 2 beans instead of just getting 1, right? But if you both always just put down 1 bean, neither of you will reach your goal. You just both put down 1 and get nothing, put down 1 and get nothing, put down 1 and get nothing. So, if an overarching power is necessary to enforce cooperation to reach the best result, it would seem that if you make people actually play the bean game, no one would ever win. Everyone would just continually put down 1 bean and have no more beans than when they started with. But in reality, it doesn't work this way. I have my students play this game in class, and when they do, they almost always learn to cooperate without any coercion from me. Many times, they will simply put down 2 beans from the very beginning and then just very quickly reach their goal. Other times, someone might defect by putting down a single bean and stealing the other person's 2 beans, but a quick tit for tat will teach them their lesson, and they soon learn to cooperate. Once I had 2 students reach 4 beans each, 1 shy of their goal, but in the next turn, one of them put down 1 bean, stealing the other one's 2 beans. This meant that he reached his goal, but she was now short of her goal. And all he had to do to keep his goal but keep her from reaching hers was just put down 1 bean for the rest of the game. But disapproving moans and groans from the class coerced him into letting her achieve her goal. And this is what serious anarchists suggest would happen in the real world. Mutual interest and even social pressures will guide us to cooperation. No government coercion is needed. And this doesn't just happen in my class. This happens in real-life social experiments as well. It does seem that people learn to cooperate without an overarching government or force forcing them to do so. Such thought experiments might be insufficient to prove that we would all cooperate in an anarchist state, but there is other evidence that this is the case, that we would learn to cooperate in an anarchist state. And that's the fact that society has organized into government in the first place. If you trace it back far enough, we used to live in an anarchist state. Maybe biological humans have never actually lived in that kind of society, but our ancestors at some point were without government or social organization. But they eventually learned to cooperate, which led to the formation of society and ultimately government. That means, regardless of whether the government has moral authority or whether we'd be better off without it, government may just be inevitable. Even if serious anarchists were successful in convincing us all that we should rid ourselves of government, we would likely just start cooperating again and form a new one. In fact, it is perhaps the reason behind this cooperation that provides government with its moral justification. This cooperation may be the basis of what is known as a social contract, and it is to the social contract theory that we shall turn in the next lecture.